1871. 300 men wearing the marks of the Ku Klux Klan surrounded a black church in the Mississippi Delta and announced they would burn it before sunrise unless one man walked out alive. Inside were families, elders, children, counted, trapped, and already condemned by men certain no one would resist. The Klan leader promised mercy, lowered his rope, and waited for fear to finish the work. Then the torches started dropping, one by one, snuffed out from distances no mob rifleman could reach. By dawn, dozens of horses lay bleeding, command voices were silent, and the church still stood. Federal papers would later list the night as an uprising, not a massacre avoided. What the Klan never admitted was this: they believed they were hunting victims. They had surrounded trained killers who remembered the war better than anyone, and arrogance sealed the outcome. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The church smelled of linseed oil and old hymn books, of worked earth carried in on boot soles, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers wilting in mason jars along the windowsills. Ezekiel Hardin stood behind the pulpit, carved from Mississippi pine, watching the congregation settle into their final prayer. Sunlight slanted through the western windows, painting amber stripes across upturned faces, faces he knew by name, by story, by the particular weight each carried into this wooden sanctuary every Sunday. "Let us go forth in peace," Zeke said, his voice carrying the measured cadence he'd learned to master over 9 years of preaching. "Let us walk as children of light, even when darkness presses close." The congregation murmured their amens. Children fidgeted in the back pews. Elderly Sister Parsons gripped her cane, lips still moving in silent prayer. Jacob Freeman, the blacksmith, helped his wife to her feet, their youngest daughter asleep against his shoulder. Zeke closed his Bible with deliberate gentleness. His hands, large and scarred along the knuckles, rested flat against the worn leather cover. These were hands that had once held a Sharps rifle with surgical precision, that had counted windage and elevation in the moments before exhaling death across Confederate lines. Hands that had killed 23 men he was certain of, and perhaps a dozen more he would never know for sure. He flexed his fingers slightly, feeling the old ache in his right thumb where shrapnel had torn through at Vicksburg. That life was buried. It had to be. "Reverend Hardin?" Isaiah Bell approached the pulpit, his young face bright with the particular earnestness that still believed words could reshape the world. 22 years old, raised in a freedmen's school in Tennessee, educated enough to quote Frederick Douglass, and naive enough to think the quotes mattered to men who measured power in rope and fire. That was a powerful sermon. The passage about turning swords into plowshares, it spoke to me deeply. Zeke managed a small smile. "I'm glad it reached you, Isaiah. Do you truly believe it's possible? That we can build a future without violence?" The question hung between them like smoke. Zeke glanced past Isaiah's shoulder to where his wife Ruth moved through the congregation, collecting hymn books with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything. She wore a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, and to anyone watching, she appeared to be nothing more than a preacher's wife tidying up after service. But Zeke knew the truth. Ruth's eyes swept the windows in a pattern, north, east, south, west, checking sight lines the way a soldier checked perimeters. "I believe," Zeke said carefully, "that we must try, but trying doesn't mean being foolish." Isaiah nodded, though uncertainty flickered across his features. "My father always said that meeting violence with violence only creates more violence. Your father was a wise man, but he also died when night riders burned our home in Memphis." Zeke's chest tightened. "I know, son. I know." The conversation ended there, suspended in the space where philosophy met memory. Isaiah moved away to help stack benches, and Zeke descended from the pulpit, nodding to departing families, the Johnsons, the Washingtons, the elderly Callaways who had been enslaved on the same plantation where their grandchildren now sharecropped under only slightly different terms. Each family carried fragments of hope, mixed with bone-deep weariness, the particular exhaustion that came from surviving in a world designed to erase them. Outside, the dogs had gone quiet. Zeke paused mid-step, his hand resting on the back of a pew. Every farm within a mile kept dogs, hunting dogs, working dogs, the half-wild mutts that barked at anything that moved after dark. The evening air should have been full of their noise as families headed home through the settling dusk. Silence pressed against the windows instead. Ruth appeared at his elbow without making a sound. She set down her stack of hymn books, her movements unhurried, her voice pitched for his ears alone. The Freeman dogs stopped barking 10 minutes ago. The Parsons dogs 5 minutes after that. Could be anything, Zeke said, but his pulse had already shifted into the slower, steadier rhythm he remembered from night watches in Tennessee, from the moments before dawn raids when waiting meant survival. Could be, Ruth agreed. She turned a page in the hymnal she held, as if discussing nothing more urgent than next week's music selections. Mary Johnson sent her youngest to tell me there's smoke smell on the north wind. Not cooking smoke, torch smoke. Zeke's jaw tightened. How long? Long enough for families to get home if they leave now. Not long enough if they don't. He looked out across the remaining congregation. 15 people still gathered in small clusters, talking in low voices, reluctant to leave the only place that felt even partially safe. Children chased each other between pews. Old man Silas Washington dozed in the corner, his head tilted back against the wall. Ruth touched his wrist briefly, a gesture invisible to anyone not watching for it. Abraham's watching the tree line from the bell tower. He'll ring once if it's clear, twice if... A single bell tone echoed through the church, sharp and final. Then silence. Then 2 more bells, fast and urgent. Zeke's training took over before thought could interfere. "Everyone inside," he called out, his voice carrying the command he'd learned to project across battlefields. "Bring the children in from the yard. Now." Heads turned toward him, confusion spreading across familiar faces. Isaiah stepped forward, his forehead creased with questions he didn't voice. Sister Parsons gripped her cane harder, her ancient eyes suddenly sharp with understanding, born from decades of reading danger in white folks' silences. "What's happening?" someone asked. "Just a precaution," Ruth said smoothly, already moving toward the door to usher in the last stragglers. "Storm coming in, looks like." But Zeke could smell it now, faint on the wind through the open door, the acrid bite of pine pitch and kerosene. Not cook fires, not tobacco smoke. The particular scent of torches meant to be seen, meant to announce presence and intent. The last of the families hurried inside. Jacob Freeman handed his sleeping daughter to his wife, his face hardening into the expression of a man calculating odds he didn't like. The blacksmith understood numbers the way Zeke understood windage. Both had learned their mathematics in fire. "Bar the doors," Zeke said quietly. Isaiah's eyes widened. "Reverend, if we bar the doors, how will people leave?" "They won't." Ruth moved to the front entrance, sliding the heavy oak beam into its iron brackets with practiced ease. "Not tonight." The sound of distant hoofbeats reached them then, rhythmic and deliberate, the sound of men riding in formation rather than traveling. Dozens of horses, maybe more. Moving through the woods, along paths meant to converge on this single point, this wooden building that stood in a clearing like an island in the gathering dark. Zeke crossed to the window and looked out through the wavy glass. The sun sat low on the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Beautiful, if you didn't know what was coming. Beautiful, if you couldn't read the shadows. A single torch appeared at the tree line, held high like a standard. Then another. Then 10 more. then too many to count, spreading through the woods in a widening circle, a noose of fire tightening around the church. The encirclement had begun. The torches multiplied in the darkness like fallen stars crawling across the earth. They moved with purpose, spreading through the tree line in patterns too organized to be random, too deliberate to offer hope of accident or mistake. 300 men, maybe more, enough to turn the clearing around the church into an amphitheater of firelight and shadow, enough to ensure every window framed a view of encirclement complete and absolute. Inside, the congregation pressed together in the center aisle, instinct drawing them away from the walls, away from windows that had stopped being protection and started being sightlines. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Men positioned themselves between their families and the doors, as if bodies could stop what was coming. The air grew thick with held breath and whispered prayers, with the particular terror of waiting for violence that announced itself before arriving. Zeke stood at the pulpit, his hands resting on the worn wood, his face composed in the expression he'd practiced for 9 years. The calm of faith, the steadiness of a man who believed God's protection extended beyond the physical. But inside, different calculations ran through his mind like water-finding channels. 300 men in a circle with a radius of roughly 100 yards, torches spaced at intervals of perhaps 15 feet. No military formation, no professional discipline, but numbers enough to overwhelm through sheer mass. Standard night rider tactics, maximum visibility, maximum psychological pressure, minimal actual organization. He counted the windows. 4 on each long wall, 2 flanking the entrance, 1 behind the pulpit. 12 points of potential breach. The doors, front and back, were solid oak, barred from the inside, but wood burned regardless of thickness, given enough heat and time. The roof was pine shingle, dry from summer heat, vulnerable. His right hand flexed against the pulpit edge, muscle memory seeking the familiar weight of a Sharps rifle that wasn't there. "Brothers and sisters," he said, his voice carrying across the frightened silence, "let us pray." Heads bowed, some out of habit, some out of desperation, some because closing your eyes against what you couldn't stop felt like the only power left. "Lord, we come before you in this hour of—" A voice cut through the night, amplified by the acoustics of open space and deliberate projection. Male, educated, carrying the particular confidence of a man accustomed to having his words obeyed. "Ezekiel Harden, we know you're inside." The congregation stiffened. A child began to cry, the sound quickly muffled against a mother's shoulder. Zeke kept his eyes closed, his lips still moving in prayer, but his ears tracked the voice, coming from the north side, probably mounted given the height and clarity. Single speaker, authority figure, someone who expected attention and submission. "We have no quarrel with the innocent souls gathered in that church," the voice continued, smooth as honey poured over broken glass. "We are Christian men. We seek only justice, not bloodshed." Ruth moved to Zeke's side, her face composed but her fingers drumming once against her skirt. Their private signal. Recognized the voice. Confirmed threat. She'd told him about Colonel Thomas Wickler 3 months ago, when her network of washerwomen and kitchen workers first brought word of a new leader consolidating Klan activity across 3 counties. Former Confederate officer, though his actual military record was thin at best. Talent for theater and organization. Charismatic enough to unite disparate night rider groups under single command. Dangerous not because he was violent, but because he made violence systematic. "We want only one man," Wickler called out. "One man whose inflammatory preaching has stirred rebellion and discord. One man who has forgotten his place in God's natural order. Surrender Ezekiel Harden, and the rest of you may go home to your families unharmed." Zeke opened his eyes. Around him, the congregation had turned to stone, every face locked in the moment between hope and horror. Because the offer sounded reasonable, It sounded like mercy. One life traded for dozens. One man's sacrifice to save children, elders, innocents who wanted only to worship in peace. Isaiah Bell stood near the back, his young face twisted with the agony of principles meeting reality. Sister Parsons gripped her cane with both hands, her expression unreadable. Jacob Freeman caught Zeke's eye and gave a single small shake of his head. "Don't." Ruth's hand found his elbow, her touch light, but her meaning clear. She knew what Wickler was. She knew the promise was a lie, that men who surrounded churches at night with 300 torches didn't negotiate in good faith, didn't honor terms with people they'd already designated as less than human. But Zeke also knew what happened when offers like this were refused. The fire would come, the bullets would follow, and children would die screaming while their parents watched helpless, while the night swallowed justice whole and left only ash. "You have until midnight," Wickler announced. "Then we will assume you value one guilty man over the lives of everyone inside. The choice is yours. Choose wisely." Silence crashed down like a physical weight. Midnight. Less than an hour. "Reverend," someone whispered. "What do we do?" Zeke looked out across the faces of his congregation, the people he'd married, baptized, buried, counseled through grief and guided through joy. Every one of them waiting for him to offer answers he didn't have, solutions that didn't exist, miracles that required rewriting the fundamental mathematics of power in Mississippi. His hands trembled against the pulpit, not from fear, from the effort of keeping them still, of not reaching for weapons that weren't there, of not falling back into the self he'd buried 9 years ago when he decided the war was over and God's work began. "We pray," he said finally, "and we trust." But even as he spoke the words, his mind continued its tactical assessment. 300 men outside, 15 families inside, 12 windows, 2 doors, 1 hour. The numbers didn't add up to survival. They never had. Ruth began leading the congregation in hymns, her clear voice cutting through panic like light through fog. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The others joined in, voices shaking but persistent, finding courage in familiar words. Children stopped crying. Men straightened their shoulders. For a moment, faith felt like armor. Zeke descended from the pulpit and moved toward the front door, his steps measured and deliberate. Ruth's singing faltered for just a beat, her eyes finding his. He shook his head slightly. "Trust me." She resumed the hymn, her voice steady again, leading the others while watching her husband walk toward surrender. Isaiah appeared at his side. "Reverend, you can't—" "I can," Zeke said quietly. "And I will. They'll kill you. Maybe. But maybe they'll keep their word." "You don't believe that." Zeke looked at the young man's earnest face, at the principles that hadn't yet been tested in fire. "What I believe doesn't matter as much as what happens if I stay." He reached for the door bar, his hands steady now that decision had simplified everything. The congregation's singing grew louder, desperate, as if volume could hold him back. But Zeke lifted the heavy oak beam and set it aside, the scrape of wood against iron brackets cutting through the hymn like a blade. "Brother Hardin!" Jacob Freeman called out. "Don't do this!" But Zeke was already pushing the door open, stepping out into the torchlight alone. The night air hit him like cold water, sharp and clarifying. 300 torches painted the clearing in shades of orange and shadow. 300 faces, hidden behind white hoods and robes, turned toward him as one. The theatricality of it was almost impressive. The coordinated menace, the visual weight of organized hatred. Colonel Wickler sat on horseback 20 yards from the church entrance, his hood pulled back to reveal a handsome face in its early 40s, clean-shaven and aristocratic. He smiled as Zeke approached, the expression warm and patronizing, like a father greeting a wayward child. "Ezekiel Hardin," Wickler said. A man of courage, after all. I'm pleased. Zeke stopped 10 feet away, his hands loose at his sides, his body language open and unthreatening. I came in good faith. Honor your word. Let them go. Wickler's smile widened. Of course, I am a man of God, same as you. I understand the power of sacrifice, the nobility of— The torch in his hand exploded. Not dropped, not fumbled. Exploded. The oil-soaked head disintegrating in a spray of sparks and burning debris that sent Wickler's horse rearing sideways. The colonel cursed, fighting for control of his mount, his confident smile vanishing into shock. The crack of the rifle shot reached them a heartbeat later, sharp and precise, echoing across the clearing from somewhere deep in the darkness beyond the torch line. 300 heads turned toward the sound. Zeke didn't move. His face showed only mild surprise, as if the shot had been as unexpected to him as to anyone else. But inside, his pulse had shifted into combat rhythm. 300 yards, maybe more. Clean shot, despite distance and darkness. Sharp's rifle, almost certainly. Creedmoor sight. Someone who knew what they were doing. Wickler regained control of his horse, his patrician features twisted into fury. Who fired that shot? No answer came from the darkness, only the fading echo of smoke and cordite drifting across the clearing like a ghost's breath. The second shot came before Wickler finished his question. Another torch. Another clean hit. This time from a different angle, northwest instead of north. The burning brand spun through the air and landed in dry grass, forcing 3 clansmen to scramble backward as flames spread across the ground. Panic rippled through the white-robed crowd. Men who'd stood in careful formation moments earlier now shifted nervously, torches wavering, heads turning toward shadows that suddenly seemed full of threats. Horses whinnied and stamped. Someone shouted an order that got lost in the rising confusion. Inside the church, the congregation had gone silent. The hymns died mid-verse as all eyes fixed on the doors Zeke had left open, on the slice of torchlit chaos visible through the gap. Ruth set down her hymnal with precise deliberation. She walked to the center aisle, her footsteps loud in the sudden quiet, and knocked twice on the wooden floor with her heel. Then, twice more. A pattern, deliberate and unmistakable. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the floorboards moved. A section of floor beneath the third pew on the left lifted silently, revealing darkness below. A scarred hand emerged first, gripping the edge, then a shoulder, then the weathered face of a man in his 50s. Gray hair, deep lines around his eyes, a puckered scar running from temple to jaw. He pulled himself up with practiced efficiency, turned, and reached back down into the hidden space. Another man handed up a rifle, then another. Then the second man climbed out, younger, but just as marked by time and violence, missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The stumps healed into calluses that suggested years of adaptation. More panels opened. Behind the pulpit, a false wall swung outward on hidden hinges. 2 men emerged from that space, both lean and gray-bearded, moving with the economy of motion that comes from decades of calculated survival. In the bell tower above, a trap-door dropped open and a rope descended, followed by a man who rappelled down with his rifle strapped across his back. Beneath pews, behind wall panels, under the altar, in the crawl space between ceiling and roof. One by one, 20 men materialized from compartments so cunningly concealed that the congregation, people who'd worshipped in this building for years, stared in disbelief at spaces they'd never known existed. They were old. Every single one of them carried the weight of years in the stiffness of joints, the gray of hair, the deep lines etched by sun and suffering. But their hands were steady, their eyes were clear, and their weapons were immaculate. Rifles cleaned and oiled to perfection, ammunition belts distributed with mathematical precision across their bodies. The first man who'd emerged, the one with the jaw scar, moved to the front of the church with the confidence of command. He wore simple farmer's clothes, patched and worn, but something in the way he carried himself demanded attention. He surveyed the congregation with pale blue eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "Caleb Moore," Ruth said quietly, introducing him to people too shocked to speak. "Formerly 2nd Sharpshooter, Army of the Potomac, Gettysburg, Antietam, Petersburg." Moore didn't acknowledge the introduction. He was already assessing positions, counting heads, calculating angles. "Windows," he said, his voice rough from disuse or tobacco or both. "Thomas, Jackson, Freeman, you three. Northwest, northeast, southwest corners. Elevated positions. You know your ranges." 3 of the snipers moved immediately, no questions asked, climbing toward the choir loft and bell tower access with their rifles. The remaining 17 spread through the church with practiced efficiency, each man finding his assigned position as if they'd drilled this maneuver 100 times, because they had. Sister Parsons found her voice first. "What? What is this?" Ruth turned to face the congregation, her composed mask finally cracking to show something harder underneath. "This is survival. This is what happens when you stop waiting for justice and start building your own." "You knew," Jacob Freeman said slowly, his eyes moving from Ruth to the emerging snipers to the open floor panels. "You planned this. All of it." "Yes." Ruth's voice held no apology. "I leaked information through my contacts. False intelligence about increased organizing, about weapons stockpiles that didn't exist, about rebellion that was nothing but rumor. I made sure it reached Wickler's ears. I made sure he'd come tonight. In force, where witnesses could see and document everything." Isaiah Bell stared at her, his face pale. "You used us as bait." "I used us as testimony," Ruth corrected. 300 Klansmen surrounding a church full of innocents at Sunday worship. That's a story that reaches beyond Mississippi. That's evidence that can't be denied or hidden. Outside, more shots cracked through the night. Measured, precise, each one eliminating another torch, another rallying point, another symbol of organized intimidation. The Klan's careful formation was dissolving into chaos as men scattered for cover that didn't exist, as horses bolted, as officers shouted contradictory orders into darkness that offered nothing but more rifle fire. The congregation turned to Zeke, who'd re-entered the church during the confusion, sliding through the door and barring it behind him. He stood before them now, his preacher's composure completely gone, replaced by something older and infinitely more dangerous. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry we didn't tell you. I'm sorry we put you at risk. But I'm not sorry we fought back." "You lied to us," someone said. "You preached patience and prayer while planning violence." "I preached survival," Zeke replied. "And sometimes survival requires more than faith. It requires force." Caleb Moore moved to Zeke's side, his scarred face impassive. "Positions confirmed," he reported, as if addressing a commanding officer rather than a preacher. 20 rifles, ammunition sufficient for sustained engagement. Sightlines optimal. Enemy force estimated 300, poorly trained, panicking. "We can hold through dawn, if necessary." "It won't be necessary," Ruth said. "They came for spectacle. They didn't come prepared for war." Moore allowed himself a thin smile. "Then we'll educate them." He raised his hand, fingers spread. The snipers throughout the church went still, weapons ready, eyes on their commander. Outside, Wickler's voice could be heard shouting orders, trying to rally his forces, demanding return fire. Caleb Moore's hand closed into a fist. 20 rifles spoke as one. The coordinated volley was surgical in its precision. No wild spray of bullets, no panicked shooting. Each sniper had marked his target. Klan officers, identifiable by their position, their horses, their authority. Men who gave orders rather than followed them. Men whose removal would shatter command structure and turn organization into chaos. 7 men fell in the first volley. Not killed. Moore's orders had been specific about that. But wounded, disabled, removed from leadership. Officers who'd ridden to a church burning discovered themselves bleeding in Mississippi dirt, while their followers scattered like startled birds. The second volley came 30 seconds later, timed with the same precision. 5 more officers down. Wickler's voice rose in fury and fear, demanding counterattack, but his forces were already breaking, fleeing toward tree lines and darkness, abandoning torches and formation in their desperation to escape the unseen guns that picked them apart with mechanical efficiency. Inside the church, the congregation watched in stunned silence as 20 old men conducted warfare like a symphony. Coordinated, disciplined, devastating. These weren't random shots. This wasn't panic or rage. This was practiced expertise applied with absolute clarity of purpose. This was soldiers remembering what they'd been taught to forget. The rotating fire patterns began at 10 minutes past 8, when full darkness had settled over the Delta and the Klan's initial panic had solidified into desperate attempts at regrouping. Caleb Moore established the sequence with hand signals, 3 fingers raised, then 2, then a closed fist. The snipers understood immediately, shifting from coordinated volleys to staggered rotation. Each man would fire, reload, and rest, while others maintained pressure. Continuous harassment designed to prevent organization, to deny the enemy any moment of safety to gather and plan. The mathematics of it were brutal in their simplicity. 20 rifles, each requiring approximately 20 seconds to reload. Staggered properly, that meant a shot every second. 60 shots per minute. 360 shots per 6-minute rotation. Enough to keep 300 men pinned down, scattered, and increasingly demoralized as the night dragged on. Thomas Freeman fired from the northwest window, his target a cluster of Klansmen attempting to establish a firing line behind their horses. His bullet took the lead horse in the shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough to send the animal screaming and rearing, scattering the men behind it. They dove for cover that didn't exist, abandoning their weapons in their haste to escape hooves and rifle fire. 20 seconds. Reload. Scan. Next target. In the bell tower, Jackson Peters, the youngest of the snipers at 48, both his knees destroyed at Cold Harbor, braced his rifle against the tower frame and methodically extinguished torches. 1 shot, 1 torch dead. No wasted ammunition, no dramatic gestures, just steady, patient elimination of every light source the Klan tried to establish. Darkness was advantage. Darkness was survival. Keep them blind and afraid. The choir loft held 3 more snipers positioned to cover the southern approach. They worked in perfect synchronization, 1 firing while 2 reloaded, creating an overlapping field of fire that turned the church's rear flank into a killing zone for anyone foolish enough to attempt approach. A Klansman carrying a torch toward the back door discovered this when a bullet shattered the torch 6 inches from his hand. He dropped it immediately, stumbling backward into darkness. His companion tried to retrieve it. The second shot took his hat clean off his head. They didn't try again. Inside the church, Isaiah Bell pressed his back against the wall beneath one of the windows, his eyes squeezed shut, hands clamped over his ears. Each rifle crack made him flinch. Each distant scream of wounded man or horse sent tremors through his frame. He'd preached nonviolence his entire adult life. He'd counseled patience, prayer, and faith in divine justice. Now divine justice smelled like gunpowder and sounded like controlled murder. Isaiah, Ruth's voice close to his ear, barely audible over the gunfire. Isaiah, look at me! He opened his eyes. Ruth knelt beside him, her face illuminated by the brief muzzle flash from Thomas Freeman's rifle overhead. She looked tired. ancient. But her hands were steady as she gripped his shoulders. "Listen to me," she said. "You don't have to participate. You don't have to shoot. But you need to help keep people calm." "This is wrong," Isaiah whispered. "This is murder. This is survival." Ruth's eyes held no doubt, no conflict, only the terrible clarity of someone who'd made peace with necessary violence. "Those men came to burn us alive. They brought rope to hang Zeke in front of his own children. This isn't murder, Isaiah. This is refusal." A child started crying, one of the young ones who didn't fully understand what was happening but could feel the terror radiating from every adult in the room. The sound cut through the gunfire, sharp and devastating. Sister Parsons began to sing. Her voice started soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried a hymn they all knew, "Steal Away to Jesus," the song of secret meetings, of escape, of finding safety in darkness when daylight offered only chains. Other voices joined hers, quietly at first, then with growing strength. Old Brother Marcus added his bass. The Johnson sisters harmonized. Even some of the children joined in, their voices high and pure against the backdrop of rifle fire. The snipers didn't stop shooting, but the rhythm of their fire seemed to shift, to accommodate the music, to create spaces where voices could rise and fill the church with something besides fear and powder smoke. Isaiah found himself singing. His voice cracked, his hands still shook, but the words came anyway. Muscle memory from a lifetime of worship, comfort in familiar syllables, even when the world had become unfamiliar and terrible. Between verses, he heard Caleb Moore giving quiet orders. "Jackson, ease back on the tower position. You're exposing your silhouette. Freeman, shift left. They're trying to flank using that wagon for cover. Williams, wait for my signal before the next volley." The strategic language of warfare delivered in the same calm tones someone might use to direct a church social. Near the front of the church, Zeke moved among his congregation, touching shoulders, offering water from the communion cups they'd filled before the siege began. He'd removed his preacher's coat. Beneath it, he wore a simple shirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms scarred from old burns and blade wounds. The hands that had gestured in benediction hours earlier now checked ammunition count, verified sight lines, reinforced defensive positions. "Pastor," Jacob Freeman said as Zeke passed, his voice heavy with questions he didn't know how to ask. How can you?" "I was a soldier before I was a preacher," Zeke said quietly. "I thought I could leave that behind. I thought I could build something better with prayer and patience. But they wouldn't let us have peace, so we'll take survival instead." A fresh burst of gunfire erupted from the eastern windows, 3 quick shots that sent a group of Klansmen diving behind a stone fence. One of the snipers, a man named David Carter with only one working eye, called out distances and wind adjustments to his neighbors. They modified their aim accordingly. The next shots cleared the fence, forcing retreat. The hymn shifted to "Wade in the water." The message was clear. Go where they can't follow. Find safety in places they fear to tread. The children sang louder now, some of them finding comfort in the music, in the act of unified resistance, even if they didn't understand its full meaning. Isaiah watched a sniper. Williams, he thought, the one with missing fingers, pause between shots to make the sign of the cross. The gesture was brief, almost unconscious, but it revealed something. These men weren't monsters. They were believers who'd learned that belief sometimes required bullets. Outside, Wickler's voice carried across the darkness. Hoarse from shouting orders his forces could no longer follow. The careful intimidation ritual had collapsed into chaos. Men who'd come for spectacle now huddled behind inadequate cover, waiting for dawn, for rescue, for any excuse to flee with their lives. Near midnight, the pattern changed. The gunfire from outside had diminished to occasional wild shots, panicked men firing at shadows, wasting ammunition, revealing positions. Caleb Moore raised his hand, signaling ceasefire. The snipers lowered their weapons, listening. Hoofbeats. Distant, retreating. Wickler was pulling back, regrouping somewhere beyond rifle range. The church held its collective breath. Silence descended, not peaceful, but heavy with exhaustion and waiting. The hymns faded. People slumped against walls, holding children, checking on elders. The air hung thick with powder smoke and sweat, and fear temporarily suspended. Ruth moved to a window, peering carefully into darkness. "He's not done," she said quietly. "He's just learned he can't win tonight." Caleb Moore nodded. "Then we wait, and we prepare for dawn." Midnight brought no relief, only a different kind of suffering. The silence outside was worse than gunfire. At least during combat, the snipers knew where the enemy stood, could track movement, could maintain the illusion of control through precise violence. Now they waited in darkness, while Wickler regrouped somewhere beyond their limited visibility, planning whatever horror dawn would bring. Inside the church, exhaustion settled over the defenders like a physical weight. Caleb Moore sat against the wall beneath the northwest window, his rifle across his knees, both hands wrapped around his swollen joints. The arthritis had started in his fingers during the siege, a familiar burning that spread up through his knuckles, into his wrists, turning simple movements into exercises in controlled agony. He'd felt this before, years ago, when cold rain and endless marching had transformed his body into something that worked against him. But his mind remained clear, sharp, calculating. "Williams," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the exhausted silence. "How many rounds remaining?" The one-eyed sniper checked his ammunition pouch, counting by touch in the dim light. 43. Freeman? 38. Peters? A longer pause from the bell tower. 26. Caleb did the mathematics automatically, his brain still functioning with the precision that had made him legendary during the war. 20 snipers, averaged 35 rounds each. 700 shots total. Enough for perhaps 90 minutes of sustained fire at their current rate. Maybe 2 hours, if they rationed carefully. Picked only high-value targets. Not enough for a dawn assault if Wickler came with everything he had. "Conserve ammunition," Caleb ordered. "No more suppression fire. Only confirmed targets. Make every shot remove a threat." Ruth moved through the church, distributing water from the communion pitcher, her movements methodical despite obvious fatigue. She'd been awake for nearly 36 hours, organizing intelligence, coordinating the trap, maintaining calm among terrified families, but her hands didn't shake. Her voice remained steady. "Drink slowly," she told Sister Parsons, who gulped water like someone drowning. "Small sips. We don't know how long we'll be here." Near the back of the church, Zeke knelt beside Jacob Freeman's wife, helping her tend to a young boy who'd cut his hand on broken glass during the initial chaos. The wound wasn't deep, but it needed cleaning, bandaging, attention that felt absurd while surrounded by rifle fire and death. "Hold still, Thomas," Zeke said gently, using the communion wine to clean the cut. The boy whimpered, but obeyed. "You're being very brave." "Pastor Zeke," the boy whispered, his eyes wide with questions children shouldn't have to ask. "Are those men going to kill us?" Zeke paused, his hands steady on the bandage but his mind wrestling with how to answer truthfully, without destroying whatever innocence remained. "Not tonight," he said finally. "Tonight we're protected, because God is watching, because good men are shooting straight." The words felt like ash in his mouth. Theological compromise delivered in simple sentences a child could understand, but which violated everything Zeke had preached for 15 years. He'd built his ministry on peace, on turning the other cheek, on faith that divine justice would eventually balance earthly suffering. Now he was bandaging children between reloading rifles. A commotion at the eastern window drew his attention. David Carter, the one-eyed sniper, had spotted movement, figures attempting to advance, using the darkness and silence as cover. 3 clansmen, moving low and fast toward the church's blind spot near the foundation. "Range?" Caleb asked, his voice sharp despite the pain clearly visible in his face. "100 yards," Carter responded. "Maybe 95. Hard to judge in this dark. Can you make the shot? With one eye? In darkness? Moving targets?" Carter chambered around. "Used to could. Guess we'll find out if I still can." He fired. The lead clansman dropped immediately, screaming. Not dead, the scream confirmed that, but removed from the fight. His companions dragged him backward, abandoning their approach. One shot, one threat eliminated. The arithmetic of survival. Zeke felt something twist in his chest. Pride, maybe. Or recognition. The same cold satisfaction he'd felt at Antietam when his shots had dropped Confederate officers at impossible distances. He'd thought he'd killed that part of himself through prayer and penance and dedication to peace. But apparently, you couldn't pray away what you were good at. You could only choose when to use it. "Pastor." Caleb's voice, quiet but insistent. Zeke moved to where the old sniper sat, noting how Caleb's fingers curled inward like claws, the joints swollen to twice their normal size. The man could barely hold his rifle, but his eyes tracked every movement outside, cataloging positions, calculating angles. "We're going to need everyone who can shoot," Caleb said. "When Wickler comes at dawn, he'll throw everything forward. Overwhelm our firing capacity through pure numbers. We won't have time for rotation patterns or careful target selection." Zeke understood what Caleb wasn't saying. "You need me in the line. I need the second-best sniper in Sherman's army in the line." Caleb's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile if it contained any warmth. "The best one can't hold his weapon anymore. So that makes you the best we've got." The rifle leaning against the wall seemed to pulse with accusation. Zeke hadn't fired it yet tonight. Hadn't needed to. The other snipers had maintained the defense while he'd played preacher, comforting families, leading prayers, maintaining the fiction that his transformation from killer to shepherd was complete and permanent. "I swore I was done," Zeke said quietly. "You swore a lot of things." Caleb shifted position, grimacing as his knees protested. "How many of those oaths still matter if we're all dead by sunrise?" Isaiah Bell, still pressed against the nearby wall, spoke up. "Pastor, you don't have to. You can stay who you've become. Let the soldiers do the soldiers' work." "And if the soldiers aren't enough?" Zeke asked. "If Wickler breaks through and gets to the children? To Ruth? To you?" He met Isaiah's eyes. "Would my clean conscience matter then?" No answer. Just the weight of impossible choices in a situation designed to make righteousness fatal. Zeke picked up the rifle. The weight was familiar, comfortable, like greeting an old friend he'd hoped never to see again. His hands checked the mechanism automatically, muscle memory from years of practice. Thousands of rounds fired, hundreds of men killed at distances where he never had to see their faces clearly. He moved to the eastern window, taking position beside Thomas Freeman. The older man nodded acknowledgement but said nothing. No judgment, no welcome. Just the silent recognition of one killer acknowledging another. Outside, the darkness was beginning to thin. Not sunrise yet, but the deep black of midnight giving way to the gray that preceded dawn. Shapes became slightly more distinct. Movement could be tracked with marginally more accuracy. And from the tree line, perhaps 400 yards distant, came the sound of horses. Many horses. The jingle of harnesses and equipment. Wickler assembling his forces for whatever final push he'd planned. "Here it comes," Caleb said, his voice carrying to every sniper position. "Controlled fire. Prioritize mounted officers. Break their command structure first, then worry about the crowd." Ruth extinguished the single candle that had been providing minimal light inside the church. Total darkness now. Better for the snipers, worse for the families huddled on the floor. The children had stopped crying hours ago. Now they just waited, silent and terrified, while their parents held them and prayed soundlessly. Zeke sighted down his rifle, finding the comfortable position, the stance he'd held countless times before. His breathing slowed, his hands steadied. Everything that made him a preacher fell away, leaving only the cold precision that had made him valuable to the Union Army. The first riders emerged from the tree line, torches held high, making themselves perfect targets. Wickler had learned nothing. Or perhaps he believed superior numbers would overwhelm tactical disadvantage. He was about to discover otherwise. "On my mark," Caleb said quietly, his voice somehow carrying to every position without rising above a whisper. "Make them pay for every inch." The riders advanced, 20 of them, 30, more emerging from darkness. Caleb's hand dropped. Fire. The synchronized volley shattered the pre-dawn silence with mathematical precision. 20 rifles firing as one, each bullet finding its intended target with the kind of accuracy that comes only from years of practice and the acceptance of what you are. Mounted officers dropped first. Clean headshots, center mass, horses left riderless as their commanders toppled backward into darkness. Wickler's carefully organized charge collapsed before it properly began, formation breaking apart as men realized their leaders were dead before the first torch reached the church walls. Zeke's first shot took down a rider at 300 yards. The man fell without ceremony, without drama, simply ceasing to exist as a threat. Zeke chambered another round, found another target, fired again. The ritual was automatic, mechanical. His mind had separated from his hands, allowing muscle memory to handle what his conscience couldn't witness. "Reload," Caleb ordered, his voice steady despite hands that could barely grip his own weapon. "Second wave in 5 seconds." The surviving riders had scattered, some charging forward in panic, others wheeling their horses to retreat. Both groups made themselves vulnerable. The snipers adjusted angles, compensated for movement, fired again. More men fell. Horses screamed. The carefully orchestrated assault became chaos, then became rout. Thomas Freeman eliminated a Klansman attempting to throw a torch through the window. The man's arm was still raised when Freeman's bullet found his heart. Torch falling harmlessly short, rolling across dirt that had been baked hard by weeks without rain. David Carter, working with his single eye and decades of experience, methodically cleared the southern approach. 3 shots, 3 bodies, no wasted ammunition, no hesitation. The younger snipers, men barely past their 20s who'd learned their craft in the war's final months, maintained suppression fire on the tree line, preventing reinforcements from advancing. They lacked the older men's supernatural accuracy, but made up for it with disciplined fire patterns that created overlapping kill zones. Isaiah Bell, pressed against the wall with his eyes shut, could track the battle by sound alone, the crack of rifles from the church, the answering fire from the Klan, wild and poorly aimed, bullets striking dirt and wood and empty air, the screaming, the chaos of men who'd expected to burn helpless victims discovering they'd surrounded a fortress instead. Ruth moved through the church distributing ammunition from carefully hidden reserves, her face expressionless, but her mind calculating. She'd planned for this moment, orchestrated it, leaked the intelligence that drew the Klan in force, knowing that decisive confrontation was preferable to endless terror. But knowing something intellectually and witnessing it physically were different experiences. The bodies accumulating outside represented men she'd helped kill through information warfare. Their blood stained her hands as surely as any sniper's. She handed Zeke a fresh box of cartridges without speaking. His eyes met hers briefly, recognition passing between them, acknowledgement of shared guilt and shared necessity. Then he returned to firing, and she moved on to the next position. The eastern sky began changing. Not true sunrise yet, but the deep black giving way to gray. then to pale blue at the horizon's edge. Shapes became clearer. Faces could almost be distinguished. Caleb saw Wickler immediately. The colonel sat his horse at the tree line's edge, visible now in the growing light, watching his carefully planned assault disintegrate. Even at 400 yards, Caleb could read the man's posture, rigid with fury, disbelief evident in every line of his body. "Peters," Caleb said quietly. "You see him?" From the bell tower, Michael Peters confirmed. "Colonel on the gray mare. Range 410 yards. Can you disable the horse without killing it?" A pause while Peters calculated wind, distance, the moving target. "Yes. Do it. I want him alive." Peters fired. The horse went down, legs collapsing cleanly. Not a killing shot, but one that removed mobility. Wickler tumbled from the saddle, rolling in dirt, coming up covered in dust and rage and humiliation. Two more snipers targeted Klansmen, attempting to reach him. Both fell before completing 3 steps. Wickler was isolated now, surrounded by dead and dying men, unable to retreat without exposing himself to rifles that had demonstrated their precision repeatedly. "Cease fire," Caleb ordered. "Hold positions. Watch for counterattacks." The shooting stopped. Sudden silence felt almost worse than the noise, broken only by moaning from wounded men scattered across the clearing. The clan's assault had lasted perhaps 8 minutes. In that time, Wickler had lost 30 men, maybe more. The survivors had fled into the woods or lay bleeding in the dirt, and the church stood unburned, untouched, except for scattered bullet marks that had missed their targets. Zeke lowered his rifle, hands trembling now that the shooting had stopped. He'd fired 14 times. Couldn't say how many hits, how many men he'd killed. Didn't want to know. Didn't want to calculate that particular arithmetic. Isaiah finally opened his eyes, staring at the carnage visible through the windows. Bodies wearing white robes now stained red. Abandoned torches smoking in dirt. The physical evidence of violence delivered with surgical precision. "We won," Isaiah whispered, voice hollow with shock. "We survived," Ruth corrected quietly. "Winning comes later." Sunlight broke over the horizon properly now, flooding the clearing with morning light that revealed everything. The full scope of the clan's defeat lay exposed. Broken formation, dead officers, scattered weapons, Wickler himself kneeling in dirt surrounded by bodies. Inside the church, families began emerging from beneath pews and behind walls. Children cried in relief. Elders offered prayers of thanksgiving. The congregation had expected to die tonight. Instead, they'd witnessed their protectors deliver destruction on those who came bearing it. Sister Parsons clutched her grandchildren, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Lord." But Zeke heard different words beneath the prayer. "Thank you, snipers. Thank you, rifles. Thank you, violence delivered first." Caleb stood with difficulty, joints protesting, and moved to where Wickler remained visible. "Freeman, Carter, secure the prisoner. Carefully. He's more valuable alive." The 2 snipers emerged from the church, rifles ready, approaching Wickler with the wariness of men who'd seen trapped enemies suddenly produce hidden weapons. But Wickler offered no resistance. He simply knelt in the dirt, staring at the church that had become a fortress, at the bodies of men who'd followed his orders into slaughter. They bound his hands with rope that had been prepared for hanging victims. Poetic justice, though nobody spoke the observation aloud. As Freeman and Carter walked Wickler toward the church, a new sound reached them, distant but approaching. The rattle of wheels on the dirt road leading to the church. Multiple wagons, moving fast. Ruth climbed to the window, shading her eyes against the rising sun. Her expression shifted, not quite alarm, but something close. Recognition. "Federal marshals," she said quietly. 3 wagons, maybe 15 men? The relief that had filled the church moments earlier drained away, replaced by new tension. Federal authority arriving. not to arrest the Klan, to restore order as the government defined it. The federal marshals arrived with the casual authority of men who'd never questioned their right to dictate terms. 3 wagons carrying 15 armed representatives of a government that had freed the enslaved but never particularly cared whether they survived freedom. Marshal Cornelius Hayes stepped down first, a thick man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had stopped seeing individual people years ago, seeing only categories instead. Lawful and unlawful, compliant and resistant, white and colored. He surveyed the clearing with its scattered bodies, abandoned torches, blood soaking into Mississippi dirt. His expression never changed. This could have been a livestock auction for all the emotion he displayed. "Who's in command here?" Hayes called toward the church. Caleb Moore emerged, moving slowly, arthritis worse now after hours of combat. He carried his rifle low but visible, making no threatening gestures but refusing to pretend he was unarmed. Caleb Moore, former sergeant, 1st United States Sharpshooters. Hayes nodded once, acknowledging military service the way you might acknowledge that someone mentioned the weather. "You're responsible for this?" Caleb gestured at the bodies. "They came to burn us alive. We defended ourselves." With 20 concealed riflemen positioned in a church, Hayes pulled a document from his coat. "That's not defense. That's an ambush. That's premeditation. They announced their intentions yesterday," Ruth said, appearing in the doorway. "We had witnesses. They surrounded a church full of families and threatened to burn it unless we surrendered Ezekiel Hardin for execution." Hayes glanced at her briefly, the dismissive look men gave women who spoke without being addressed. "And you are?" "Ruth Hardin, schoolteacher, preacher's wife, the person who documented everything that happened here." She held up a leather journal, pages filled with names, dates, testimony. Hayes didn't reach for it, didn't ask to see it. Evidence that contradicted his predetermined conclusion held no interest. "Surrender your weapons," Hayes ordered, addressing Caleb again. "All firearms will be confiscated pending federal investigation." "Investigation of what?" Zeke stepped forward now, still holding his rifle. "Investigation of why we refused to die quietly? Investigation of an armed insurrection against lawful assembly." Hayes gestured at the Klan bodies as if their white robes made them legitimate. These men were exercising their constitutional right to gather. Isaiah Bell laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "They gathered to commit murder." "That's speculation," Hayes replied. "What's documented fact is that 20 armed men fired from concealment on civilians. That's conspiracy to commit violence. That's organized rebellion." One of the other marshals was already moving toward the church, reaching for David Carter's rifle. Carter, weathered and one-eyed and tired beyond measure, simply let it go. No point fighting this particular battle. Freeman surrendered his weapon next. Then, Peters from the bell tower. One by one, the snipers who'd saved 70 lives were disarmed by representatives of a government that had decided survival through competence looked too much like uprising. Zeke watched it happen, his rifle still in his hands, weighing options that all led to the same place. Resist and die. Comply and face arrest. Either way, the protection they'd built was being dismantled. He handed his rifle to a marshal, half his age, who accepted it like confiscating a stick from a child. "Wickler," Caleb said, pointing at the bound man still kneeling in dirt. "He organized this, planned it, led 300 night riders to terrorize families." Hayes walked to Wickler, examining him with more interest than he'd shown the church survivors. "Colonel Thomas Wickler?" "Marshal Hayes." Wickler's voice carried relief and calculation in equal measure. "Thank God you've arrived. These insurgents attacked a peaceful assembly, killed dozens of men exercising their lawful rights. Peaceful assembly." Zeke's voice was flat with disbelief. "With torches and nooses. Symbolic speech," Wickler said smoothly. "Protected expression of political opinion." Hayes produced a knife and cut Wickler's bonds without ceremony. "Colonel, you'll need to provide testimony about tonight's events." "Of course." Wickler stood, brushing dirt from his robes. "I'll document everything. The unprovoked attack, the military-grade weapons, the clear evidence of organized rebellion." Ruth watched this reversal with the hollow feeling of witnessing something she'd predicted, but hoped wouldn't materialize. The careful documentation in her journal meant nothing to men who'd already decided which version of events served their interests. "Marshal Hayes," she tried again. "We have testimony from 40 witnesses. Children who saw the Klan surround our church. Elders who heard the threats. Testimony from colored witnesses regarding white men." Hayes shook his head slightly. "That's inadmissible in most courts. Even if it weren't, it contradicts physical evidence." "What physical evidence?" Isaiah demanded. Hayes gestured at the clearing. 30 dead men killed by precision rifle fire from concealed positions. That's not defense. That's warfare. And private citizens don't wage war on American soil without consequences. Wickler was already walking toward one of the marshal's horses, moving with the confidence of a man who knew the system would protect him. He paused near Zeke, close enough that only they could hear. "You thought preparation would save you," Wickler said quietly. "Thought competence would earn respect. But competent colored men terrify them more than helpless ones. You just proved you're dangerous. They'll make sure that lesson is remembered." He climbed onto the horse, settling into the saddle, straightening his dirt-stained robes. For a moment, he sat there, surveying the church that had defeated him, the congregation that had refused to burn, the snipers who'd shattered his carefully orchestrated terror. Then he smiled. Not a grin of victory, but something worse. The satisfied expression of a man who'd lost the battle but could already see how the war would be rewritten in his favor. "Marshal," Wickler said, "I'll be at my plantation if you need additional testimony. Send word when the trials begin." Hayes nodded. "We'll be in touch, Colonel." Wickler rode away slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone in the church could watch him leave unpunished. Behind him, 30 of his followers lay dead. But he rode like a man vindicated, protected by a government that had decided organized black competence was more threatening than white terrorism. By noon, the marshals had established a perimeter around the church, declaring it a crime scene. By early afternoon, they began making arrests, not of Klansmen, but of snipers. Caleb Moore was taken first, then Freeman, then Carter, then 3 younger veterans whose names would be recorded as insurgents rather than defenders. They offered no resistance. Fighting marshals would give Hayes exactly the excuse he needed to justify deadly force. Families watched their protectors being led to wagons in chains. Children cried. Elders prayed. Ruth stood in the church doorway, journal still clutched in her hands, evidence that no one in power wanted to see. Zeke remained free for now. Hayes seemed content to let him witness the consequences before making arrests. The message was clear. You survived the night, but survival without permission looks like rebellion. Isaiah sat on the church steps, staring at the wagons where former Union soldiers were being loaded like criminals. "We won," he said again, but the words held no meaning anymore. Zeke watched Wickler's distant figure disappear down the road toward his plantation, toward safety, toward a legal system that would frame mass murder as lawful assembly and precision defense as criminal conspiracy. The church stood unburned. The families lived. The snipers had delivered exactly what they'd promised. And by afternoon, the government was dismantling everything they'd built, rewriting courage as criminality, transforming protection into insurrection. The sun hung low, bleeding orange across Mississippi Delta sky, when Hayes finally gave the order to clear the area. Not an evacuation, a dispersal. He wanted families gone before federal witnesses arrived, wanted the narrative clean. Armed militants, dead civilians, justified intervention. "You have until morning to vacate the church grounds," Hayes announced. Anyone remaining will be considered part of the criminal conspiracy. Ruth moved through the congregation with practiced efficiency, not panicked, but deliberate. She'd planned for this moment the same way she'd planned for the siege, knowing that victory would be reframed as transgression, that competence would be punished more severely than helplessness. "Martha, take your children to the Johnsons' farm," she directed quietly. "Samuel, your family can shelter with the Washingtons until this settles. Don't pack more than you can carry. Move quickly, but don't run. Running draws attention." Families gathered what little they'd brought to Sunday service: hymn books, Sunday coats, children's hands clutched tight by mothers who'd watched them nearly die and now had to scatter them across the county for safety. Isaiah helped Mrs. Patterson, 73 and arthritic, down the church steps. "Where will you go?" "My daughter's place in Greenwood," she said. "But I lived through worse than this." "We all have." She touched his face with surprising gentleness. "You did right, child. Don't let them convince you otherwise." By the well, Caleb Moore was already gone, taken in the first wagon of arrested men. But his voice echoed in Ruth's memory from the night before. "If they come for us after, we scatter. Prearranged routes. No patterns they can track." She watched Freeman slip into the tree line heading northeast, moving with the careful invisibility of a man who'd survived 4 years of war by knowing when to vanish. Carter went south, following the creek bed. Peters waited until full dusk, then disappeared west toward the river. 20 snipers had emerged from beneath the church floor. By nightfall, 19 were gone, scattered into swamps and forests and distant relatives' homes across 3 states. Only the arrested men remained, and Zeke, standing in the church doorway, watching families disperse into gathering darkness. "You should go too," Ruth said, appearing beside him. "Hayes will send men to find me." Zeke's voice was steady, but exhausted. "Running just makes them chase, and they'll use the chase as proof of guilt. They've already decided you're guilty." She pulled her journal from her apron. "But guilt requires testimony, requires documentation, requires witnesses willing to speak." Zeke glanced at the leather-bound book. "Hayes won't accept colored testimony. Hayes doesn't matter." Ruth opened the journal to pages filled with names, dates, detailed accounts written in her careful schoolteacher's hand. "He's just one marshal in Mississippi, but there are newspapers in Chicago, veterans organizations in Boston, abolitionist societies in Philadelphia who've been waiting for exactly this kind of story." She'd made copies, 3 of them, sent north with trusted hands 2 days before the siege, when she'd known how this would end, regardless of who survived the night. The journals contained everything: Wickler's threats documented verbatim, names of Klan members identified by informants, testimony from 40 witnesses describing the siege, detailed account of the snipers' defensive action, and photographs. Ruth had arranged for a traveling photographer to document the church from multiple angles before the siege, establishing that it was a legitimate house of worship, not a fortress. The man had been expensive and suspicious, but his plates were already on their way to New York along with Ruth's documentation. "You photographed evidence before it happened?" Zeke stared at his wife with new understanding of how thoroughly she'd planned this. "I photographed the truth," Ruth corrected. "What Hayes does with local facts doesn't matter if national truth is already distributed. Wickler relies on secrecy, on the Klan's actions being whispered about but never proven. I took away the darkness." Isaiah approached, carrying the last of the medical supplies. "Marshals are posting guards around the perimeter. They're not letting anyone leave with weapons or documentation." "They already searched my journal," Ruth said. Hayes looked at it for 30 seconds and dismissed it as inadmissible testimony. She smiled slightly. "He never asked if I'd made copies." From the tree line, a marshal shouted orders. More wagons arriving. Hayes was establishing a temporary command post, turning the church grounds into an official investigation site. By tomorrow, There would be federal witnesses, military observers, bureaucrats collecting evidence that would support the predetermined conclusion. But tonight, while they were still organizing, Ruth's documentation was already 50 miles north and moving fast. "What happens when they read it?" Isaiah asked. "When northern newspapers publish accounts of 300 Klansmen besieging a church?" "Public pressure," Ruth said. "Not immediate. Not clean. But sustained attention from people who matter. Union veterans who will recognize names of the snipers. Journalists who will ask why federal marshals arrested men for defending families. Religious organizations who will question why a church was declared an insurrection site." She closed the journal and tucked it back into her apron. "Wickler survives tonight on legal technicalities, but he can't survive sustained national scrutiny. Neither can Hayes. Neither can a system that arrests heroes and releases terrorists." Zeke watched the last families disappear into darkness. 70 people saved. 20 snipers scattered. A night of perfect tactical execution being rewritten as criminal conspiracy by men who feared competent resistance more than they condemned organized terror. "They'll still arrest you," Ruth said quietly. "Probably tonight." "I know." He'd known since dawn, since the moment Wickler walked free and vindicated. The system couldn't allow a black man to organize successful armed defense without consequences. Not in Mississippi. Not in 1869. Not anywhere the old order still pretended legitimacy. "Then we should prepare." Ruth moved back into the church, past the loose floorboards where snipers had hidden, past the pulpit where Zeke had preached that morning about faith and deliverance. She retrieved a small leather case from behind the communion table. Inside, clean shirt, Bible, legal documents establishing Zeke's military service and honorable discharge. Everything a man might need when being processed through a system designed to deny his humanity. "You fought for this country," Ruth said, helping him into the clean shirt. "Served with distinction. Earned the same rights they're about to pretend you don't have." She buttoned the collar with steady hands. "But the documentation proves otherwise. And now that documentation exists in places they can't reach." Through the window, Zeke could see Hayes organizing his men, preparing to make the arrest he'd been building toward all day. The performance of law enforcement applied to a man whose only crime was refusing to die on schedule. Ruth straightened his collar, examined him the way she might examine a student before important examinations. "You'll survive this. The truth is already moving. It just takes time to arrive." Boots on the church steps. Marshal Hayes entering with 2 deputies, official warrant in hand, performance of legitimacy wrapped around predetermined injustice. "Ezekiel Hardin," Hayes said formally. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit armed insurrection against lawful assembly." Zeke held out his wrists without resistance. The iron shackles closed with familiar weight, the same government-issued restraints that had once held enslaved people, now repurposed for free men who'd defended themselves too competently. Hayes led him outside as the last light drained from the sky, Sunday evening bleeding into Monday darkness. Behind them, the church stood intact, unburned, victorious in ways the law refused to acknowledge. 2 days later, the newspapers arrived. They came on the Tuesday morning train from Memphis, bundled in twine and already read by conductors who'd passed copies down the line. The Chicago Tribune, the Boston Evening Transcript, the Philadelphia Inquirer, publications that mattered to people who controlled money, votes, and Northern moral authority. The headlines were identical in their outrage. "Mississippi Church besieged by 300 Klansmen. Union veterans defend families. Arrested by federal marshals. Lawful assembly. Surrounded house of worship with torches." Ruth stood in the general store, watching white customers read in stunned silence. The documentation had arrived exactly as planned. Photographs of the church before the siege, testimony from 40 witnesses, detailed accounts of Wickler's threats transcribed verbatim. Her careful schoolteacher's handwriting reproduced in crisp newspaper typeface, transformed from inadmissible colored testimony into undeniable Northern fact. "This can't be accurate," the storekeeper muttered, studying the Tribune's front page. 300 men don't just surround a church. They do, when they believe nobody's watching, Ruth said quietly. The man looked up, recognizing her. His face changed, not with hostility, but with the uncomfortable awareness of being caught in a narrative he'd preferred to ignore. "You were there?" "I documented it." She met his eyes directly. "Every word in those papers is true. Every name, every threat. Every moment your neighbors spent surrounded by men with torches who promised to burn children alive unless we surrendered." The storekeeper set down the newspaper. He didn't apologize, didn't offer support, but he didn't argue either. That was progress measured in silence, the absence of immediate denial being the first crack in accepted lies. Outside, more papers were being distributed. Ruth watched them spread through the town like water through dry ground, carried by hands that had never considered what happened at black churches after dark, never questioned why federal marshals arrested defenders while releasing attackers. By afternoon, the first Union veterans arrived. They came quietly at first, men in their 40s and 50s wearing blue service coats, medals still pinned despite the years. Former soldiers who'd read the names in Ruth's documentation and recognized brothers, commanders, fellow snipers from Gettysburg and Antietam. Men who'd been promised that winning the war meant something permanent. Captain James Morrison, formerly of the 5th Massachusetts Infantry, walked directly to the Marshal's temporary headquarters and announced himself. "I'm here to observe federal proceedings involving Union veterans." Hayes looked up from his desk, clearly unprepared for Northern witnesses. "This is a local matter. Armed siege of civilian families is a federal matter," Morrison corrected. "Arrest of decorated veterans for defending non-combatants is a federal matter. Releasing men who surrounded a church with burning torches while detaining the people who survived them. That's a federal matter I intend to observe personally." More veterans appeared throughout the day. Some came individually. Others arrived in groups, comparing service records and matching names to Ruth's documentation. By evening, 40 Union soldiers were camped outside the Marshal's headquarters, not threatening violence, but establishing presence that couldn't be dismissed as local colored agitation. These were white men, Northern men, voters who'd preserved the Union and expected their government to honor the principles they'd bled for. Hayes sent urgent telegrams requesting guidance. The responses came slowly, each one more carefully worded than the last. Federal authorities who'd been content to let Mississippi handle local matters were suddenly aware of national scrutiny that couldn't be managed through regional manipulation. By Wednesday morning, journalists arrived. Real ones this time, not local stringers who could be pressured or bribed. Reporters from Chicago and Boston carrying notebooks and aggressive questions, interviewing anyone who'd witnessed the siege. They photographed the church from multiple angles, documenting bullet holes in the walls, scorch marks where torches had burned close enough to char wood, but not close enough to ignite. They interviewed Ruth extensively. Her documentation became their framework, her careful accounting transforming into front-page stories that Northern readers consumed with breakfast coffee and growing anger. Decorated snipers arrested for defending families. Federal Marshal releases Klan commander, detains church members. They surrounded us with children inside. Witnesses describe siege. The stories didn't rely on colored testimony alone. The journalists were careful about that, knowing Southern courts would dismiss anything that depended solely on black voices. Instead, they interviewed Union veterans who confirmed the snipers' service records, military historians who verified tactical details, Northern religious leaders who expressed horror at a church being declared an insurrection site. They built a narrative that white Northerners could accept, not because it centered black survival, but because it framed the siege as an insult to Union victory, federal authority, and basic Christian decency. The truth remained the same, only the audience changed, and with the audience came pressure that Mississippi authorities couldn't ignore. By Thursday, Wickler's name appeared in Northern papers, not as an anonymous Klan leader, but as Colonel Thomas Wickler, former Confederate officer, current leader of terrorist organization, man who'd threatened to burn families alive and walked free while his victims faced federal charges. His photograph, obtained from Confederate military records, appeared alongside testimony describing his threats in exact detail. The anonymity that had protected him dissolved completely. Northern readers who'd never heard of rural Mississippi churches now knew his name, his face, his documented crimes. Union veterans organizations sent letters demanding his arrest. Religious groups called for investigation. Republican congressmen facing elections couldn't ignore constituents who demanded accountability. Wickler had relied on darkness, on violence that happened in places Northern authorities didn't care about, committed by men whose names never reached important papers. Ruth had taken away the darkness and replaced it with documented, photographed, testimonially verified truth that couldn't be unseen. The federal pressure shifted like weather changing. Hayes received new instruction, not explicit reversals, but carefully worded guidance suggesting that continued prosecution might prove complicated given current public attention, and that alternative resolutions should be explored to maintain regional stability. Translation: drop the charges before this becomes a national embarrassment. On Friday morning, Isaiah Bell was released without explanation. The charges, conspiracy, armed insurrection, disrupting lawful assembly, quietly dismissed through paperwork that never acknowledged error, only reconsidered circumstances. By afternoon, the remaining arrested snipers walked free. And at sunset, Zeke emerged from the marshal's custody, shackles removed, technically vindicated though no apology was offered. Wickler didn't appear for his scheduled testimony. His lawyers filed paperwork citing health concerns, requesting postponement. The postponement became indefinite withdrawal. He retreated to his estate outside town, no longer attending public gatherings, no longer making theatrical appearances that had once seemed so powerful. Disgrace came slowly, but it came completely. 5 months later, in early spring, the new church stood completed. Not wood this time, brick. Red clay fired hard in kilns 2 counties over, transported by wagons that arrived weekly through winter. The construction had taken longer than anyone wanted, but the congregation insisted on permanence. No more structures that could burn in a single night. No more walls that remembered flames. The bricks were laid with deliberate care by men who'd never done masonry before, but learned because paying white contractors meant inviting sabotage. Every course was checked for level. Every joint was mortared twice. The building rose slowly, stubbornly, visibly, a statement that couldn't be missed by anyone traveling the road. When finished, it looked fortress-like. Walls 2 bricks thick. Windows set higher than before, narrower, defensible if necessary. The bell tower rebuilt stronger, its platform capable of holding weight that had nothing to do with church bells. Nobody mentioned these details explicitly, but everyone understood them. The church had been rebuilt to stand. Zeke preached again on the first Sunday morning after completion. The congregation filled every pew. Families who'd hidden through the months of uncertainty, children who'd grown quieter but were learning to trust walls again, elders who'd witnessed too much but refused to surrender attendance. His sermon was about Nehemiah rebuilding Jerusalem's walls, working with trowels in one hand and swords in the other. He didn't explain the metaphor. Nobody needed explanation. Faith doesn't mean forgetting how to defend what matters, Zeke said, his voice carrying through the new acoustics easily. It means remembering that protection and prayer aren't opposites when your family's survival depends on both. His hands gripped the pulpit edges. Carpenter's hands that still knew how to hold rifles. Preacher's hands that still offered communion. The contradiction had stopped bothering him. He'd learned that righteousness wasn't about choosing between violence and faith, but about understanding when survival demanded both, and accepting the weight of that knowledge. Isaiah sat in the front row, listening with the attention he'd always given to Zeke's sermons, but his expression carried something new. Not quite hardness, he remained too gentle for that, but a soberness that came from witnessing what mercy actually cost, when systems were designed to exploit it. After service, Isaiah taught the children outside. Not just scripture this time. Reading and writing, certainly. Basics that white schools refused to provide and that remained essential for survival in a world built on paperwork and legal manipulation. But also observation. How to notice when dogs stopped barking. How to recognize hoofbeats by rhythm and number. How to count distances and estimate angles without seeming to pay attention. "Why do we need to know how far away things are?" a girl asked, maybe 8 years old, practicing with string and stakes. Isaiah smiled gently, because knowing what's around you keeps you safe. Because understanding distances means you're never surprised. Because smart people pay attention to things others miss. He didn't mention rifles or kill zones, but the older children understood perfectly, having learned these lessons in darker contexts. The young ones would understand eventually, when they were old enough to carry the knowledge safely. Ruth watched from the church steps, observing the children's lesson while her attention tracked the road. Always the road. Her position offered clear sight lines in 3 directions, her hands never far from the documentation case she kept ready beside the door. The habits hadn't faded with the months. If anything, they'd sharpened. Victory hadn't made her careless. It had taught her exactly how fragile stability remained, how quickly circumstances could reverse if attention wavered. The newspapers had moved on to other stories. Northern interest had faded as new scandals captured attention. The Union veterans had returned home, satisfied that federal authorities had been embarrassed into minimal accountability. The journalists had filed their final stories and departed for more urgent assignments. But the systems that had surrounded a church with torches remained intact. Wickler had retreated, not disappeared. The Klan had fractured under exposure, but not dissolved. The federal government had dropped charges without admitting error, leaving the legal framework that had arrested defenders while releasing attackers completely unchanged. Ruth understood this perfectly. The documentation had worked because it had embarrassed powerful people during a moment of national attention. But embarrassment wasn't structural change. It was temporary discomfort that faded once witnesses stopped watching. So she watched instead, cataloging every wagon that passed, noting which white landowners avoided the road entirely now, which ones nodded cautiously, which ones stared with undisguised resentment at brick walls they'd expected to see burned, building new networks of information that extended further than before, reaching into towns and counties that had thought themselves safely distant from consequences. The land was quieter now, not peaceful. Ruth had stopped believing in peace as a permanent condition, but subdued in ways that suggested wariness rather than safety. The Klan still existed, but its members moved differently now. Fewer theatrical demonstrations, fewer public gatherings, more awareness that darkness alone no longer guaranteed impunity. They'd learned that silence could be answered with documentation. That isolation could be broken through networks extending beyond regional control. That victims who seemed powerless might be counting, recording, preparing responses that wouldn't arrive until the moment of maximum exposure. The darkness had learned it could be answered, not defeated. Ruth wasn't naive enough to believe 20 snipers and documentation had destroyed systemic oppression, but answered with intelligence, discipline, and memory that transformed isolated terror into documented crimes with northern witnesses. That knowledge changed behavior. Not hearts, not beliefs, but calculations about risk and consequence. As afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening, families began departing. Parents collecting children. Elders moving slowly down brick steps. Wagons rolling away in groups rather than individually, maintaining the safety protocols that had become habitual. Zeke waited until the last family had gone before beginning his final duties. He checked the windows methodically, ensuring each one was properly secured. He walked the perimeter inside, confirming that the hidden compartments remained properly concealed beneath floorboards that looked entirely ordinary. The snipers had scattered after their release, some staying in Mississippi, others departing for northern cities where Union veterans could find work without constant threat. But their weapons remained, carefully maintained in spaces built specifically for storage during construction, just in case, just in preparation. Zeke didn't pray over the weapons, didn't ask forgiveness for keeping them. He'd stopped treating faith and force as contradictions requiring divine reconciliation. They were tools serving the same purpose, protecting people who mattered from systems designed to erase them. As dusk settled completely, Zeke locked the church doors. Heavy locks, new and strong, installed with keys distributed only to people the congregation trusted absolutely. The building stood solid in the growing darkness, brick walls catching the last light, windows reflecting evening sky, bell tower rising against stars beginning to appear. The land was quieter, not because peace had arrived, but because the darkness had learned a lesson it wouldn't forget. It could be answered. And answering changed everything. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.